uh, I'm Ed Fitzgerald, the president of Emeritus Center, and I want to welcome everybody here today for our program. I have with me our presenter, Professor George Robinson, and also our program director, Dean Napkin. And like I was saying, we do record these primarily so that we can put them on our website and share with our fellow emeriti who might have been interested in the program but weren't able to attend. So I think that's it for me. Dean, I'll turn it over to you so you can formally introduce George.
Okay. I'll go over here on this side. Today's the best day so far with technology. So let's hope for the rest of the session goes in. If you don't know, we have an IT guy that comes every session and helps us set up. So thank God for Joe Bent. It's my pleasure to welcome George with us today. George Robinson is Professor Emeritus, Department of Biological Sciences here at the university. Dr. Robinson joined the University at Albany faculty in 1994, following graduate work at UC Davis and postdoctoral appointments at the University of Kansas and Rutgers. While on the teaching faculty, his extensive academic service was complemented by several off-campus professional appointments, including associate scientist, New York State Museum, several positions at the Ian Hike Preserve, and is that right? Hike? Thank you. And Biological Research Station, and a sabbatical year as visiting scientist with the Environmental Management Bureau of New York State Parks. In addition to ongoing research and academic service, he serves on the New York State Invasive Species Advisory Committee and recently joined the Ecosystems Technical Working Group for the upcoming New York State Climate Impact Assessment. His research has been supported by NSF, USDA, US EPA, USGS, I don't know what half of these acronyms are, and USFWS. Last year, he was elected as the William L. Reese Fellow for 2022. George lives in Albany with his wife, Dr. Ingrid Peters Robinson, and their parrot, Theophrastus. George, it's all yours. Thank you.
I call him Mr. T. The Theophrastus is the Greek philosopher who is considered the father of botany. Well, I guess I have to go here. The slideshow. Oh, good. It works. I think you can see it. Yes. Okay. I changed the title. It was originally working between light and shadow, but then it seemed to me that as a retiree, a lot of people think we don't work. And maybe they want to take us to a repair shop. I don't know. But so I guess I am wandering, and I'll wander through this talk. And I know we're recording, so I'll try to stay on time. But feel free to interrupt if you have something poignant to say. Okay. I was really proud to share the award with Randy Craig. And, I envy him his courage and his dedication, but I don't envy him his frustrations and all the obstacles he had to overcome working, teaching in the state prisons. Well, let's see, just have to figure this out. Now I defer to, when you win an award, when I get any kind of recognition, which is pretty scarce, I defer to Amy Dickinson. How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to say your name the livelong day to an admiring bog. And kind of puts you in your place. But then Emily has to defer to my old friend Margaret Stewart, who is a world's expert on frogs. And Meg would say, no, that's not true at all. Frogs do not sing to bogs. They're trying to get girlfriends. That's what it's all about. And Meg was very special for me. She recruited me partly to help her start up the program in biodiversity conservation and policy. She was a great friend, and she kept me grounded and inspired, and she introduced me to people all over campus. We had a lot of tension because she said, you got to get tenure, you got to get tenured, you got to do this, you got to do that. But at the same time, she's introducing me to everybody, and she takes me to the art museum. You know, it was a wonderful experience because I wanted to have a full university life and not be sequestered in a lab. I could walk out of my office in 5 minutes, be in the art museum. And you know, I met all kinds of wonderful people that way. And Meg was very highly regarded. She not only got this program going, she was very well respected in the communities of field biologists and conservationists in New York. And she had amazing life experiences. Now, there were many other encounters that enriched my life. In the university, and it's hard to even begin to account for all of them. I'll just mention a few. The UUP Executive Committee, the David Janauer's choruses. That was a real highlight of my time here. I know that you were one of his stars, David. Yeah, that was great. Geography and planning, and curious experiences too. There was one time a UPD officer came to my lab, great big muscle-bound guy, holding a little evidence bag, a little plastic bag. He's holding it like this. Asked me to take a look at it. John Mackwitz, our parasitologist, wasn't around, so I put it under the microscope, and oh yeah, it's a bed bug. And so they had bed bugs in their storage lockers. So I put it in a jar of alcohol and gave it back, and he didn't want to touch it. He could have squashed me like a bug, but this bug was not his ilk. Another person I really enjoyed meeting at. There were all these committee meetings, endless committee meetings that almost never went anywhere, but it was always a chance to meet nice people. And one of them was Frankie Bailey, who spoke here recently. And at the time, she was working on a novel about the pine bush, and she wanted advice on killer coyotes. And I was discouraging, I think, because coyotes generally don't kill people. But I wish I had her advice for a lot of other things. I came out with bad timing. I came out together with my sister, an illustrator, with a children's book just before COVID. And I managed to snag a table at the Writers Festival a couple of weeks ago, and sold 3 books in the first half hour, and after that, nothing. I needed her advice on publishing and marketing and all that stuff. And you know, it struck me at listening to her presentation on the computer. She's got a wonderful speaking voice. I think she could be a narrator. I think I'd suggest that if she gets tired of writing. Well, let's go to this outline here. First, I have to explain my title a little bit more. Then we'll talk about, you know, a little bit of rambling. I hope changing the title doesn't disqualify me for the recent work, but this is the rambling. I'm going to talk about some of the unusual paths and antecedents of what got me here. Connecting on and off campus, I mentioned some of that already, and reflecting. A few weeks ago, I was privileged to be one of the interviewers for what's called the New York State Master Teachers Program. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's for public school teachers. I've done it a few times before at the School of Education. The School of Education does it. They manage it on campus. But the candidates are just wonderful. They're so dedicated and also thoughtful. And one of the things they all mentioned in our interviews is how important it is for students to reflect. High school students, middle school students, not overteach them, give them time to put it together. And that's what I've been doing, preparing this, is kind of reflecting. And and the Reese Award gave me a great opportunity. One of the concluding remarks I'm going to make, I'll tell you now, is if you're at all interested, I'd encourage you to consider applying, because if nothing else, it's a great opportunity to kind of reflect on your career and also what you've been doing since then. And I found that really valuable. Now, my title actually has two aspects. But in the meantime, I'm wondering, as well, having retired, I wonder, what I should continue from all the things that I got involved in, when to say no. And I had a hard time doing that for many years. I'm starting to learn, and it's getting easier with COVID, for example. It helps. How many medical scans and procedures do I have this month? I'm always wondering that. And will I ever get a helpful customer service? I really miss the great IT service we had here. I miss it at home, and it drives me crazy trying to get any kind of decent advice on my tech stuff. So the title is partly metaphor. So shadow and light, doubt, revelation, uncertainty, insight. I think uncertainty is the bread and butter of scholarship. Solving problems, discovering problems, elucidating them, solving them. But uncertainty can also be overwhelming too. Like this little feller here. I call this squirrel Hamlet. And this is the time of year when they're all making bad decisions about crossing roads. Now, there's also literal movement involved in moving from light between shadow and light. And that's because I work in the field. I'm a botanist and an ecologist. I sometimes work in the forest, sometimes under open sky, look below ground as well as above ground. And I study plants, and plants are remarkable, even though you look at them, hey, it's not moving, it's growing a little bit, kind of boring. I don't like it here. I'm going to dig it up and put it somewhere else. These are lupins in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. The Pine Bush Preserve has been a great resource for me. Quite a few of my students have done research there. The staff there is wonderful, the director and the head steward, and it's always been a great place for taking students and for research. Well, plants turned out to be really complicated because they're constantly communicating within and outside their own little zones. They have a very sophisticated communication system, but unlike us, it's not nerves, it's chemicals. They've got far more genes than we do because they need to produce so many different proteins to protect themselves, to communicate. This plant is communicating not only with itself, not only with its neighbors, it's communicating with pollinators, it's communicating with all the insects that want to eat it, the microbes in the soil that it's associated with. It's very complicated. And trees might be even more complicated. They live so long, they're so durable. And understanding how they grow turns out to be a real problem. It's a mystery, believe it or not. Okay, they get bigger, yeah, so what? Well, what got bigger? What's going on below ground? So those kinds of questions I try to deal with. These are real survivors. That birch on the left used to be growing on a stump and it's still hanging on, and that old hemlock on the right, they're both probably 100 years old, reaching, and they're layered. Trees are layered. They have a different light environment as you go up and down. And they're communicating that, and they're dealing with it constantly. And they can't talk. And it's very hard to query them about what's going on. We can have our blood drawn. We can have a catheter put in and have constant measurements. A tree, you can't do that. It's very hard. Once you poke a hole in a tree, you block that flow. So it's kind of difficult. So that's kind of the literal part of it. And also trees are becoming, they're notably important for absorbing carbon dioxide. And I'm sure they're on the agenda at the COP27 meeting that's going on today. So I'm going to show you an example of blending the literal and the metaphorical. And I'm going to go back in time to 1990. This is a reclamation site in the Meadowlands of New Jersey. I was at Rutgers University at the time. Why am I going back? Well, I'll explain why I'm going back to 1990 pretty soon. This is an abandoned landfill owned by the town of Kearney. That's Newark in the background. And this was abandoned for about 40 years. And the goal in this project was to forest it, to actually bring in, to somehow grow a forest, because there are very forests in this area and a lot of birds passing through that need a forest. So it was quite a project. We brought in a lot of soil, whole lot of soil, 2 feet of sand from a construction project in Manhattan, and a foot of composted leaf, decaying leaves that the town of Teaneck was storing on a public park. And then the court order said, you got to get these rid of it. So we took it. And then we started planting. And what we did was we planted trees and shrubs in particular arrays with the particular species, with the goal of having species that would spread, and not necessarily on their own, that would attract birds by providing fruits. And the fruit, and we were recognizing at the time that birds are an amazing disperser of trees. They make it happen. So it was a fairly elaborate design that I'm not going to explain at all, except for the fact that each of these little squares has trees and shrubs. And rather than spend a whole lot of money and time foresting this whole place with new recruits that were very expensive from the nursery and watching a lot of them die, which always happens, we nucleated it. That's what this is called, a nucleation experiment. In other words, you put in a lot of little populations and figure out a way to get them to spread over time. But they're trees and shrubs, so it takes a while. Well, we had some early success, very promising. We won an award from the New Jersey Native Plant Society. But then came a long bout of discouragement. Turns out this is the site in its early days. This is the 15W exit. This is the west leg of the New Jersey Turnpike. It's discouraging enough to have to drive down there. Yeah, it's a tough drive. But I was getting wind of some bad news that the town of Kearney was thinking of converting this. And then I looked at a Google map that said this was a future site of a Walmart distribution center. And at that point, I said, I'm not driving down anymore. I'm going to give up. But then some years later, Jeff Corbin, a colleague at Union College, which has a lot of great ecologists, he said, I think you have the longest running experiment on nucleation in the world. And I said, I don't think so. And I said, anyway, I called the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission, who kind of oversees this. And they said, oh yeah, it's doing great. Come on down. And so I did with Jeff and a bunch of others. There's Jeff with the arrow, some of his Union students, some Rutgers students, some UAlbany students. And we surveyed it for a couple of years. And lo and behold, it's a young forest full of native species. Birds were singing, cicadas were buzzing. It was made me pretty happy. Other things that might not make you happy made me happy, like Sandy had knocked down some trees. That's what's supposed to happen in a forest. Trees fall, it creates new habitats, mixes the soil. So we tested the soils that were looking much more like native soils than when we started.
So when the trees fall, do they make noise?
Well, this hurricane was so loud I couldn't hear. And going to today, this is that site again, the New Jersey Turnpike. And I'll just put you can see there's a lot of trees there now. And here's the original footprint of the project. So this is metaphorical in the sense that I was really discouraged and I went back from the shadow into the light. And it's also the opposite of moving from light to shadow. We took an overly bright place and give it shadow. So that's where I'm trying to mix all these. I guess I'm mixing metaphors in my title also. Rambling. So, as far as rambling goes, I had kind of an unorthodox path. although I'm not sure that I'm unique in that, but was the oldest of 9 in an Irish Catholic family in the south side of Chicago, and which put me in line to be a priest. And then I left the seminary with very few academic options. One was Loyola University, which I studied philosophy, which prepared me for a life in the 14th century. And for driving a cab, which I did, and I had sung in churches a lot, and so I was singing in Irish bars and playing, and also wandering around. I ended up becoming the manager of a showcase music club called the Quiet Night, which had some of the best acts of the 1970s who were not big enough to play arenas. We only seated 350 people, but you name it, jazz, blues, folk. I got to meet some of the smartest and most brilliant people I'd ever hoped to meet. They weren't all very kind, but they were brilliant. And then I ended up, it's a long story, in Northwest Ontario, working for a wilderness experience education program as a canoe guide and naturalist. And it occurred to me that I really wasn't a very good naturalist. And that set me on the path to go re-educate myself. And so that's the short story of how I ended up here. And as a result of these adventures, I kind of have a hard time paying obeisance to hallowed institutions or famous people. Now, that was a prelude to academia. Now, prelude to retirement, I'll start out with one of the main themes of my work that was mentioned in the Reese Award, and that is with invasive species. I was very impressed with this book. Charles Elton, most people never heard of him, but he's probably the equivalent of a Nobel Prize winner if there were such a thing, Nobel laureate, if there were such a thing for ecologists. He's a British ecologist. You might remember if you ever took some early ecology or biology, those graphs of the lynx and the hares, and that was him, and that was his work. I mean, he did so many original things. I was struck by what he said in his book. The balance of relatively simple communities, the plants and animals, is more easily beset than rich. That means that natural areas that are diverse, well protected, are much more resistant to invasive species. It's a wonderful idea. I really jumped on it. And I had an experimental system where I could test it. And I have a background in experimental biology, experimental ecology, because I'm part of this tree. Robert Payne he's another potential Nobel laureate, but I never really met either of them. I heard Payne speak, but these people are all invested in experimental ecology in one way or another. Jane Lubchenco here was the head of NOAA and Obama's science advisor. And there's a few little people on some of the branches. I'm here. And I looked at it and said, what are the mushrooms? And then I found out that those are the postdocs. So anyway, armed with this interest in experiments, I had a test of that idea that more diverse systems. I was working with plants, and I had an experimental field where I could control the number of species in a particular area, and then introduce a weedy invasive, see how it did, and just the opposite of what I expected happened. And I could only show this to a group like you because students would never understand it. This is the fact is that I called it voodoo ecology because the rich got richer. If you remember way back to when George H.W. Bush was opposing Reagan, Reagan was espousing the Laffer curve, remember? Trickle down, tax breaks for the rich make everybody wealthy. And so I called this, he called it voodoo economics. Bush did. Then he probably forgot what he said. And so I call it voodoo ecology. It's probably the only president ever cited in an Ecological Society journal, except probably Teddy Roosevelt. But and I'm sure it's the only Bush ever cited. Yeah. Well, once I got here, I had realized that, an experiment tells you something. And in fact, a lot of other work had gone on, was done subsequently that demonstrated the same thing. You can't simply make a simple hypothesis like that without understanding much more of the ecological background. But so I started meeting all kinds of folks in the New York Flora Association and other people with similar interests, many state agencies, institutions, colleges, and we formed what's called the Invasive Plant Council of New York State. And we started developing all kinds of information campaigns, lobbying. We formed a 501c3 nonprofit. I was part of the original board and president for a little while. And then we dissolved. We dissolved because we were too successful. After a while, the state had appointed a working group, which resulted in legislation that formed this whole group of invasive species management folks in multiple institutions, and they're pretty well funded now. There's a statute that set it up. One of the things I learned the hard way is if you're an officer in one of these 501, one of these nonprofits that's dissolving, don't be the treasurer. Because the federal government requires reams of paperwork for the next several years before you can close out. Yeah. But anyway, what resulted was, among other things, an invasive species council, which is managed by all the major state agencies, and an invasive species advisory council, which I belong to. And I actually am appointed by legislation through an appointment at the State Museum, not by name, but by affiliation. And we just had a meeting a few weeks ago, one of our first actual face-to-face meetings in quite a long time up at Thatcher Park. Now, one of the things we do is we advise a whole group of, there's 8 different regional partnerships for invasive species management. And they're very active, full of volunteers. The state budget this year came in at $18 million to support them. So I'm very happy to see, and then it's full of young and energetic people. So I'm very happy to kind of just take a back seat, sit at meetings, open my mouth occasionally. And it's been enjoyable to watch this, and I enjoy, and I still take part in some activities. I don't know if you've heard of this animal, the spotted lanternfly. It's a major threat that's on our borders. It's already in the New York City area, and it's devastating the grape and the berry industries in Pennsylvania. It gloms. These are the young of the adult here, and they're feeding on this tree, and in a short time the tree's dead, and it's a mess too. It's just big goo all over, and so they're a terrible threat. This is Sam Schultz. Samantha Schultz. She's one of the staff for the local prism, the Capitol Prism, and she and I set up this trap. That's a trap for these guys. And the reason it's a trap is because this tree is an ailanthus tree. You may not know it as a pest, but it's a terrible pest south of us. But I don't know why it got planted on campus. It's a shade tree in China. But it's a big one now. And so this is a sentinel because this is the tree that they're most attracted to, the lanternflies. So whenever we find pretty good sized ailanthus trees, and this is a pretty good size, traps go up. And so I monitor this every couple of weeks. This is just across from Indigenous Quad on campus here. Like I said, it's become, it's starting to show up in big numbers in New York City. I don't know if you've heard about some of the controversies. You know, some animal rights folks are complaining about the campaign to stop these because it's inhumane. So, but so far I haven't detected any. Thank goodness. Well, back to connecting. You know, I mentioned that as a big part of my experience here, you know, and how it really made the university a full experience for me. And I wasn't just stuck in a corner focused on one little project. And I think that was really valuable. And there's a lot of different ways to connect and a lot of really interesting people that I've run into. I'll mention one really important character for me. His name is Dennis O'Leary. On campus, he sometimes comes around to fix microscopes. He's a technician who repairs our microscopes. He's much more than that. He's a rock climber. He's a tree climber. I think he's 75 now. And I can't imagine anything keeping him down. And he latched onto this property in Glenmont, which is a really special place. He calls it the Bioreserve. He formed a nonprofit. He's still getting some help funding it. And this is the old Corning family estate. It's their old horse pasture, and the original house burned down, but and part of it, and right next to it is this old growth forest, which he also has tacked on with some help from a land conservancy. This is one of the most beautiful American beach I've ever seen. It's probably 200 years old, and the forest is full of them. And Dennis is just a really inspiring person, and I get to meet people like that. Next to him is another inspiring person. This is my wife, Ingrid. She's in Brazil now. She'll do anything to escape one of my lectures. No, seriously, she has her own long-term project. She's a forest geneticist, and she's helping recover lands in Brazil with native tree species. And that's been going over 20 years. And so she's down, she waited till after the elections. You know, everybody deals with election anxiety. We've got a double dose. But I'll say more about her later, I think. So Dennis has done other things. He's been putting up these tree platforms. This is not the top one. The top one's way up there. So you can study canopies. But my main interest was so I could take classes out and study the fields, because there's very few opportunities in the Albany area where you have, you know, old fields at this stage of what's called succession, where the forest is slowly encroaching. So here we are in one of his fields. This is the old horse pasture of the Corning family down in Glenmont. And people, some of the people in biology now take their classes down here, and a lot of schools from all over the region come here. Now, another really important connection for me has been the hike preserve that was mentioned at the beginning. And this was begun in 1931. It's one of the very oldest biological research stations in the country. And it's been a great resource for me and many other people in the region, and not just UAlbany, many other schools. And, you know, along the way, I've served it in many different kinds of ways, but it's special in a different way than the Albany Pine Bush. The Albany Pine Bush is under, you know, very dynamic management to maintain its pine barrens habitat. You know, so they use fire and other kinds of manipulations. The hike preserve has been unmanipulated for a long, long time, which is a very valuable thing because it gives us a baseline. You know, we live in a time of what people call shifting baselines. You know, what you used to think of as a big fish, people now think it's impossibly big. This is what a fish looks like, because they lost track of how big fish used to be. And the same thing with forested areas that are left alone. You know, they have their own pathways that we'll never understand if we don't protect them. And then they're great comparative tools for other locations that we want to, where we're trying to investigate change. And quite a few of our graduate schools, I've had about 5 or 6 master's, PhD students here, did their research at the Hike Preserve. And it's been an really important connection in that sense. And it's also helped us maintain, keep our graduate programs afloat, because it offers resources that we could otherwise never offer. And these are college interns that I was helping, that I was supervising for a summer, and behind us are some of those trees, and I'm going to talk about trees in a minute. This student here, Naima, she's from Sri Lanka. She wanted to be a PhD at UAlbany, and we had nobody to mentor her because she wanted to study birds. And well, it turns out we have a nice arrangement with the New York State Museum, and which I helped broker quite a few years ago. It's an MOU. They pay the tuition. Students get mentoring at the museum, and they get a degree from UAlbany. And so she did that. She did very well, and now she's a big star somewhere. I'm not sure where. So I'm going to turn to trees. So this is kind of the heart of my probably last project at the Hike Preserve. And part of that, part of our work is the simple question: how do you measure tree growth? I'm not going to go into a lot of details, don't worry. There's an awful lot that nobody knows. But what do you measure in a tree? You know, when people say forests are increasing or decreasing, well, we have aerial imagery that can help explain that, but it's not as good as on the ground. We often don't know what's really in a forest, and we have to measure it on the ground. But what do you measure? Half the tree is below ground. You can't pick it up and weigh it. If you extract it, it's dead. Most people measure the change in girth, because that's pretty reliable. It changes, gets bigger every year until it dies. How do you measure the height? That's not really easy. My good friend Andre Lapinus in geography and planning has developed some ways to do it, but it's complicated because, believe it or not, there's a lot of wind at the top of a tree. So you can never find out where the top is, and among other things. And then if you come back in the spring, that's broken off anyway from the winter. And there's a lot more to this, but I just want you to know that we're trying to overcome some of these problems. And one of them is we use this instrument called a dendrometer, dendro meaning tree, meter meaning instrument. And it has these very sensitive little indicators of movement. They're in a very fine spring. And when it expands and contracts, it tells you that every 10 minutes, down to the 100th of a millimeter. And it's very useful because you can all of a sudden see what goes on in a tree, at least from the outside. Here's an example. One tree. So this is spring and summer moving into fall. This is the change in the total width that we measured using this instrument. And look at how much it changes over time. The tree is growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking. It's like a straw, soda straw. That sometimes compresses, sometimes expands. Depends on the temperature, the time of day, how much sunlight. And also, the changes between day and night are pretty substantial. At the end of the year, it's grown. It's gone from here to here. But it wasn't a smooth curve. And we're trying to figure out what's going on. And a lot of that has to do with how trees allocate their water and their resources, the products of photosynthesis. And as those are moved around in a tree, the stem changes. And that's an important problem for climate change, because we know that trees absorb CO2, but what do they do with it? How much of that actually goes into the tree? How much goes into the atmosphere? Because they respire a lot of carbon, a lot of carbon dioxide. And then at the root zone, here's one of our students, Marie. This is a special camera that gets inserted into a tube in the soil, and it rotates and takes a full 360 image of the soil at different depths. And you get these pictures here of, so these are roots that have grown, and we can go back periodically and see how much they've grown, how many new roots there are, how many. You wouldn't believe how dynamic roots are. They're constantly growing and stopping, moving, trying a new direction, dying back. And roots make a tremendous demand on the tree's resources. Roots don't photosynthesize, so all of the energy that they get has to come from above. And if they're taking in more energy in the current era than they did in previous climates, then that's actually slowing the growth of the tree. So that's one of the considerations that we're investigating. And you can compare the roots and the stems. We measure other things too, but I'll just talk about these two. So this is a mean of 6 trees. So this is how the stems grow. So this is April. You can see the maximum growth is in June, and then it tails off and pretty much stops. So this is the percent of total growth. So most of the growth happens here and it stops by the fall. Well, wait a minute. Why is the maximum growth in June? We've got plenty of sun, very warm days in July and August. Well, it turns out that these trees are stressed. These are conifers. Believe it or not, a few degrees makes a big difference because leaves are very sensitive to heat, and it can shut down the photosynthetic system. And so understanding that is really critical for, projecting the capacity of trees to absorb carbon dioxide in the future. And then if you look at the roots, they're out of sync. So the roots are doing nothing here because they had a big dose of energy in the fall, the last year. They had all they needed, and now they need to start growing and growing. And so they're growing at their maximum at a time when the stem growth is reaching a minimum. So they're trading off. Something's going on to cause these trade-offs. And you have to have roots. The tree can't live without roots. And if the roots are in a bad spot, you have to make new ones. So there's that trade-off as well. But the roots are continuing to grow well outside the growth period of the stem. So understanding how these are synchronized or how synchrony is lost in these systems tells us a lot about how to measure the growth of trees in an enhanced carbon dioxide atmosphere. And that's kind of the part of that result is described in this title here. The radial growth during hot summers declines. And this is a new thing. These temperatures that we were measuring did not exist 20, 30 years ago in this area. Those periods of high temperature. It's not that high. For Albany, it's not super high. But these longer periods of hot temperature are enough to drive down photosynthesis and slow the whole process. So back to reflecting. The interest I had in climate change goes back to grad school, where it was becoming very obvious that it was an important consideration, and especially all the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. It's difficult to believe it's a hard sell today, but it still is. 4 days of consecutive 70-degree weather this week. First time in 100 some years. I mean, it seems obvious to me, but you can never use one climate event as a barometer. But as taking that interest and all kinds of others, one of the first things I did when I came here was got in the middle of a tussle, unbeknownst to me, between the new dean, Judy Gillespie, and the vice president, Karen Hitchcock, who were both struggling to take charge of what was going to be a new environmental science studies program. with some emphasis on climate change. So as part of her leverage, the dean somehow got me. I think Meg Stewart pointed me out. That was not nice. But she gave me some money to run a program on global change. So we had a bunch of seminars across the campus, and ever since then, you know, I keep trying to follow the science and then also the politics. And so reflecting includes saying yes or no. And it includes recognizing my limits. So I was offered an opportunity to join the NYSERDA climate impact assessment team. And what I decided is I'm not going to take charge. I'm not going to be a leader. I'm going to take a back seat. There's so many young people that are so intelligent and bright and energetic. Let them do the work, but also I'll just hang back there and try to help them out. And this began last year. Its purpose is to actually impact assessment, not necessarily solutions, but we look at those too. So I'm part of the technical working group on ecosystems. And as part of the program, we were handed a whole set of projected future forecasts for precipitation, temperature, major storm events, all kinds of those variables. And it was done in pretty high resolution by Lamont Doherty in Columbia. The team there, the observatory team, by region. So these are broken down into different regions with expected 20-year brackets of future climate change. So we're working with that. I really can't go into much detail because we are embargoed. In other words, until the report is out, we can't talk about the details because it's well, it's like the IPCC. They can't talk about. It's a little baby IPCC. They can't release too much in advance, especially the co-authors like me. But the difference between this and other similar kinds of initiatives in New York is that we're focused on the impacts. And we're using the physical changes projected to assess those potential impacts, of course, across regions, you know, for the next 20, 40, 60, 80 years. And we're covering, I cover several of the different ecosystems. One of the other things that we are doing is trying to avoid gloom and doom, because there's more than enough of that around. You know, we can't just throw up our arms and say it's hopeless. So one of the things that I'm working on in the document is the value of urban trees, because there's very demonstrated value in their ability to ameliorate climate, to cool neighborhoods, to add moisture to the air, to absorb heavy rainfall events, as well as fixing some CO2 as well. But urban trees are enormously important contributors. And so that's a big part of the chapters that I'm writing, is about, you know, how cities should, you know, take this into consideration. So in conclusion, I really believe I'm not very special compared to any of you. But the Reese Award, as I said, was a valuable opportunity to reflect and, you know, go through my previous time and also what I'm doing. It helps validate that maybe I'm making some decent decisions as I go forward. And then another thing is that it's the first time I've actually done one of these self-evaluations where I set the standards. It's not like one of those faculty activity reports. Remember the FARs? I mean, those were just kind of, their purpose and their use seemed very mysterious to me. And I'm sure somebody found them useful. But I'd recommend that you get yourself consider getting yourself nominated. And the process was well worth it. And regardless of the outcome, it's a great chance to reflect. And so another day, more uncertainty. as we approach the holiday. Okay, so I guess we have a little time for a question.
That was great. Thank you. I like your approach to your talk today and reflecting, and it was very intriguing. I learned a lot. It was nice to see how you've developed along in your career. Questions, please. Anybody? We're using microphones so that we also put your questions recorded.
So have you been able to see the forest through the trees?
It's interesting because except in the deepest, darkest Amazon, there's no such thing as a black forest. I mean, there's always some light getting through. Even in the Amazon, there's bits of light that get through here and there. And there's a whole realm of plants and animals that have adapted to that change in light and keep tracking it. I've never studied them myself. A lot of people have.
Well, that was a joke question.
No, but I think there's a serious angle. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I have no sense of humor.
The tree hugger is getting a more a serious relationship that way, I guess. Does the Corning family still own that preserve?
No, Dennis owns it, or his nonprofit owns it. Yeah,
So people can go there and.
I think. I'm not sure what the situation is now. I'm not sure what his insurance coverage is like, but he does have school groups coming, and so I think that anybody can probably just wander in. He does have a caretaker, so you might have to knock on the door and make sure they know that you're not hunting or doing something they don't want. Yeah.
Yes.
One of the most interesting books I've read recently is.
Oops, we got a.
Go ahead.
One of the most interesting books I've read recently is a book I'm sure some are familiar with, and that's Richard Powers' The Overstory.
Mhm.
And I wondered what you had to say about that book, that way talks about trees communicating with each other and so forth.
Well, there's some controversy about that, but it's very clear that tree roots communicate between species and within species. And what communicates them is the fungi. So some people believe that fungi connect the whole forest because almost every tree has fungal hyphae, the little bits of fungi that are actually voluminous. If you can study, they're so tiny you can't see them. If you start to dig, you disrupt them. It's another problem. But so far, there's a competition, sort of friendly competition, over who can discover the largest organism on Earth. So the blue whale is sometimes a choice. There's a fern in England that has been spreading for 1,000 years, and so if you take the entire area of that could be the world's largest. And one of the recent candidates is fungus. People, I think it was in Poland. I can't remember where. No, it was in the U.S. They found these, the fungi below ground we don't see, but the mushrooms do come up, and a lot of the tree fungi do have mushrooms. And so they took the genetic footprints of mushrooms at exceedingly long distances, and they were identical. It could be the world's largest organism. A single genetic individual. So I don't know if that answers your question, but okay.
I'm in the middle of reading the Sheldrake book on musk.
Oh, Sheldrake, yeah.
Is that a worthwhile thing?
He seems like a curious character. Merlin Sheldrake. What a great name for someone who studies mushrooms. Well, he's part of a consortium now. And he seems to be maybe a little bit in the realm of fantasy, but I think he's being grounded by all these other folks that he's working with. And they're going around the world and they're studying lichens and trying to understand the importance of lichens and their role. And lichens are actually binding together all kinds of things on Earth. And they're part fungus. So, but fungi are just amazing. There's so little known about them. We have dozens and hundreds of endangered species on the list of birds and trees and butterflies, but fungi, nobody knows. We don't know what's endangered. There are, thousands of known species. There's probably 1 million total species that we maybe someday we'll discover. Yeah.
Also, I have a practical question. I own several hundred acres of forest in the Adirondacks, and it's under the state forest management plan for sustainable forestry.
Yeah.
It's a program that's been around a long time, and on reflection, is what I'm doing make sense or not from a global point of view?
Well, if it's the DEC foresters, we've been communicating with them a lot on this climate assessment, and they're very concerned about future management. As far as they're concerned, there are some good management tools that might be still successful in the future, but without recognizing them and signing on, like you probably have done, there'll be some problems. And it really depends on what your objectives are. If you want to, keep family income in the future, or turn it into a preserve.
The main objective was to be able to keep from having to develop the property.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, I'm wondering if sustainable forestry is a good use in general for forests in this area.
Well, some people would argue that, first of all, the great majority of forest cover in New York is family owned. And about 80 to 90% of all the forests that are being managed for timber are family owned. So without those family forests, we wouldn't have timber. Firewood, paper for pulp, pulp for paper. So it's a critical resource. The question is, if we start making deals with all of these individual family units in different parts of the state, in some regions, they're a critical part of the economy and jobs as well as the resource. And so there must be some level where we need to balance to keep the resource available and to keep the local economies secure, but at the same time, not do terrible damage to the forest that's irrecoverable. One of the things I'm working on now, which I can't talk about, is an expert witness in a lawsuit by an environmental group that had a protected forest, and somebody went ahead and logged it. And the damage is terrible if your intention is to preserve the forest. It's not terrible if your intention is to replant the wood in a way that is, sensible, not using the wrong species, not high grading it, not just taking out the big expensive trees. So I imagine your plan addresses a lot of that.
Anyone else?
One thing I'd like to mention about the climate impact assessment. Most of us teams, like our ecosystem technical working group, have members from indigenous communities, which is turning out to be really important because they've been living in New York for thousands of years. They know something about climate change and ecosystems. And they also are stewards. They have lots of land in New York that they're stewarding. So that's been a real eye opener for me, is to, meet with these folks. Thank you.
All right, great. Great, I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Actually, George did mention our Reese Fellows Program. For those of you who might be interested, I think we're going to be sending out the annual solicitation for nominations in a couple weeks, right? Right, Neil? Or they cut this coming going out this afternoon. Okay. Yes. So And we'll send out another reminders in December and January, but the deadline, I believe, is January 31st for the new fellows for 2023. And we'll probably have made decisions, or usually make them by March. So keep your eyes out for that announcement if you're interested in that program. And we have one more presentation
2
scheduled.
weeks from today, Philip Morris, who's the CEO of Proctor's.
Yeah, the Proctor's Collaborative, the group that includes Proctor's and CAPREP and the University Preservation Hall, I think, up in Saratoga. Yeah,
When is that?
2 weeks from today. He's one of the leaders in local theater,
Yeah.
obviously.
He's a good speaker too.
2 weeks from today, right here.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. Very
Thank you.
good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we need to kill the recording.
Yeah.
Then we're supposed to, huh?
Turn off the recording.
Yep.
Nice seeing you.
I can't see it very well.
You gonna retire?
Maybe a few years.